In a quiet park, Jessica thought she'd found a moment of peace, but a single encounter would change her life forever. A relentless police officer with a dangerous sense of power makes it his mission to intimidate her. Not knowing her husband, Tom, is an FBI agent, as Jessica and Tom stand up to abuse of authority, they uncover corruption that runs deeper than they ever imagined. Will their courage bring justice or risk everything they have? Watch until the end to witness their struggle and the inspiring fight for accountability. If you believe in justice, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe to our channel to support stories like these. Your voice can help spread awareness. Jessica Parker strolled through the park that Saturday afternoon, a gentle breeze lightly swaying the tree leaves above. It was one of her favorite places to relax, disconnect from the city's fast-paced rhythm, and spend some time with her thoughts. She wore a light blue blouse and comfortable jeans, and a faint smile touched her face as she watched the sky's reflection in the calm lake nearby. People passed by, couples, families, joggers. Yet Jessica kept to her zone of calm, savoring the serenity of the moment. Her husband, Tom, was due to arrive soon. He always respected this time Jessica liked to spend alone, knowing the park brought her a peace she rarely found elsewhere. For her, the park was a sanctuary, where the city's hustle faded, and even her worries melted away. With her phone in hand, she sent Tom a quick message, letting him know he could meet her near their usual bench. But heavy footsteps pulled her from her focus. Jessica looked up, and instead of seeing Tom's familiar face, she was met with an imposing police officer approaching with an intimidating demeanor. He was tall and broad, with eyes that seemed to search for trouble. She tried to ignore him, turning her gaze back to the lake, but she sensed he was getting closer until he stopped right beside her. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What are you doing here?" The officer's voice sounded cold and somewhat sharp. Jessica frowned, puzzled by his tone. "Good afternoon. I'm just sitting here, waiting for my husband." He looked at her with a sneer. "Oh, really?" he replied, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "And where is this husband of yours? Is he supposed to join you at some point, or?" Jessica felt a knot tighten in her chest. The way he looked at her, as if she were doing something wrong, was unsettling. She took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "Yes, he's on his way. He should be here any moment," she responded, keeping her tone firm. The officer let out a sarcastic laugh, crossing his arms. "I don't know about that. Sounds like an excuse to me for just wandering around here. You know, it's a public park, but we can't allow just anyone to occupy these spaces freely." Jessica, shocked, widened her eyes. "Excuse me, but I don't see any reason for this questioning. I'm just waiting for my husband." The officer took a step closer, invading her personal space. "Ma'am, let's cooperate. Maybe there's something you want to tell me before I start asking more serious questions, you understand?" Jessica sensed the aggression in his tone and took a slight step back, feeling vulnerable. "I have nothing to hide. I'm simply here, waiting." "I don't understand the need for this approach." The tension in the air was thick. She tried to shake off the discomfort, but the feeling of being targeted without reason began to deeply unsettle her. She looked around, hoping to see Tom approaching, but the officer maintained his hostile stance. "Well, if that's the case, we'll see. But I've seen people try to hide behind these excuses before," he muttered, casting her a cold glance. "Is your husband some kind of hero or something?" Jessica held her ground, but the situation was becoming increasingly disturbing. The way he tried to undermine her, his questions implying guilt or suspicious behavior, all indicated he was treating her with intentional hostility. She clenched her phone in her hands, considering calling Tom or reaching out for help, but she knew that could escalate things. Besides, she wanted to believe nothing serious would come of this, that it was just a misunderstanding. But the officer showed no signs of backing down. He kept looking at her with that mix of disdain and suspicion, as if he were determined to find something wrong with her. Jessica swallowed hard, feeling time pass slowly. She glanced at the park entrance, hoping to see Tom. The discomfort was now almost unbearable, and she just wanted this to be over. Gradually, the officer began to ask even more invasive questions, inquiring about what she did for a living, where she lived, and why she was there alone. Jessica, increasingly alarmed, tried to answer calmly, but her patience and tranquility were wearing thin. "This really isn't any of your business," she finally said. "I'm simply enjoying my time here, and that shouldn't be a problem." The officer leaned in even closer, lowering himself to her eye level. "Listen here, ma'am, I am the law, and if I say you're suspicious, then you're suspicious. Got it?" His voice was now a threatening whisper. Jessica felt a knot form in her stomach. The sense of injustice was overwhelming, but she knew any attempt to directly confront him could worsen things. She took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Yes, I understand. I just wish this were handled fairly. I'm not committing any crime." The officer straightened up, a look of disdain on his face. "We'll see. We'll see when this husband of yours finally shows up, if he even exists. Until then, I'll stay here." Jessica held back the urge to roll her eyes. She knew Tom wouldn't be long, but even so, the officer's behavior left her feeling increasingly uneasy. She couldn't understand the need for this sort of approach, but resentment was already building up in her chest. As time passed, Jessica felt a glimmer of hope when she saw a group of people walking by, glancing in her direction. She hoped the officer would back off in front of witnesses, but instead, he seemed more determined to intimidate her. The power he exuded, the abuse of authority. It all made her question the safety of this place that once was her sanctuary. Tom's face appeared in the distance. He walked toward her with his usual calm expression. Jessica couldn't help but feel a sigh of relief, although she was still worried about the officer's reaction. At least now, she wasn't alone. With Tom's arrival, maybe this uncomfortable situation would finally end. Before we continue with this heartwarming story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is how you can contribute and help us continue bringing meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep going. Tom's footsteps grew louder as he approached, his tall frame casting a shadow over Jessica and the officer. His calm demeanor did not betray any concern, though Jessica could tell by the subtle crease in his brow that he immediately sensed something was wrong. "Jessica, everything okay here?" Tom's voice was steady, but a hint of protectiveness slipped through. The officer, whose name tag read Carter, turned to Tom, giving him a quick, dismissive glance. "This is none of your business, sir. We're having a conversation here," Carter said with a tone dripping with authority. Jessica took a breath, relieved by Tom's presence but frustrated by the officer's attitude. "Actually, it is his business," she replied, keeping her voice level but firm. "This is my husband." "Oh, really?" Carter's eyes flicked between the two of them, and his gaze hardened as if daring them to question his authority. "Well, sir, I'll need to ask you to step aside." Tom held his ground, looking directly into Carter's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere. I'd like to know why you're questioning my wife." A brief silence fell, heavy with tension, as Carter narrowed his eyes at Tom. His face took on a sneer, the expression of someone who believed he had nothing to fear. "Your wife here was loitering," he said, enunciating each word slowly, as if he were speaking to someone who couldn't understand. Tom's gaze didn't waver. "She was waiting for me. There's nothing wrong with that. That's for me to decide, sir," Carter retorted, emphasizing the title mockingly. His fingers tapped on his belt, the leather creaking slightly with each movement. "Now, I suggest you both cooperate before things get difficult." Jessica looked up at Tom, feeling a surge of anger and injustice bubble within her. She knew he would handle the situation, but the sheer disregard Carter displayed for their rights was infuriating. "Difficult?" Tom repeated, his voice controlled but icy. "Officer, we are well within our rights to be here, and unless there's a legitimate reason for this, I believe you're out of line." Carter's lips curled into a smirk. "And who are you to tell me about rights? What, do you think you're a lawyer or something?" Jessica felt Tom's hand gently touch her shoulder, a silent reassurance. "I don't need to be a lawyer to recognize abuse of authority." Carter's smirk faltered slightly, his expression darkening. "Watch your tone," he warned, leaning in closer to Tom. "You may think you can talk your way out of this, but I've seen people like you try. Doesn't work." "People like us?" Jessica interjected. her voice barely concealing the frustration. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound breaking the thick silence as she tried to keep her composure. "What exactly does that mean?" Carter scoffed. "Don't get smart with me, ma'am. I know your type. Thinking you can stroll around here like you own the place." Jessica's jaw clenched, her cheeks flushing with a mix of anger and helplessness. "This is a public park. We have every right to be here without being harassed." Tom, sensing Jessica's frustration, stepped forward. "Look, officer," he began, his voice still calm, but his eyes held a fire. "My wife and I are here for a peaceful afternoon. This isn't a matter of law enforcement. It's a matter of you overstepping." Carter's hand moved to his radio, his thumb hovering over it menacingly. "Maybe I need backup to handle both of you," he sneered, making a show of his authority. "That would teach some respect, wouldn't it?" Jessica's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension radiating from Tom, yet he kept his composure. "There's no need for backup," she said, trying to diffuse the situation. "We're cooperating, as you can see." "Cooperating?" Carter laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "You're lucky I haven't already taken you in for obstruction." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Obstruction? For standing in a park with my wife?" Carter's fingers flexed around his radio, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "It's all about attitude, sir. And you both have an attitude problem." Jessica could feel her hands trembling. She forced herself to take a breath, to try to focus, but the oppressive weight of Carter's presence made it impossible to think straight. Her gaze flicked to Tom, her anchor in the storm. He gave her a small, reassuring nod before turning his full attention back to Carter. "Officer," Tom said, his tone low but unyielding, "I'm going to ask you to reconsider your approach here." Carter tilted his head, a mock expression of curiosity on his face. "And why's that?" Tom's gaze hardened. "Because I'm an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I'm very familiar with the proper conduct required of law enforcement officers." The color drained from Carter's face, his smirk faltering for the first time. He took a small step back, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. You're with the FBI?" he stammered, though he quickly tried to mask his surprise. "Yes, I am," Tom replied, his voice cool and steady. "And what I've seen here today is a gross misuse of authority." Jessica watched as Carter shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to maintain his dominance. She almost felt a grim satisfaction at his discomfort, though the tension in her body remained. Tom's presence was a shield against Carter's abuse, but the damage had already been done. Carter cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Look, I was just doing my job, all right? We have to keep an eye out for suspicious activity." And she was sitting alone. Tom's jaw tightened. "Sitting alone in a park isn't suspicious, Officer Carter. It's a public space. My wife has every right to be here without facing harassment." Carter's eyes darted around, as though hoping someone would come to his aid. But the park had grown quiet, with only a few people watching from a distance, sensing the tension. He cleared his throat again, casting a reluctant glance at Jessica. "Fine. I was just following protocol." "Harassing civilians is not protocol," Tom said, his voice a hard edge. "I suggest you rethink your approach before dealing with anyone else this way." Jessica watched as Carter's face twisted with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. He looked between Jessica and Tom, clearly trying to calculate his next move. After a moment, he gave a stiff nod, his posture deflated. "Have a good day, then," he muttered, his voice laced with resentment as he turned and walked away, shoulders tense. As Carter disappeared into the distance, Jessica felt the tightness in her chest ease, though a lingering sense of anger remained. She looked up at Tom, her voice soft. "Thank you for that." Tom shook his head, his expression still tense. "You shouldn't have had to go through that. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." Jessica took a deep breath, allowing the fresh air to calm her. "Just knowing you were here, that was enough." They stood in silence for a moment, the park's quiet atmosphere gradually returning, though the memory of Carter's presence hung heavy in the air. Tom and Jessica tried to settle back into the calm of the park, but the unease from Carter's behavior lingered. Jessica could still feel the tense energy clinging to her, her hands slightly trembling even as she tried to steady them. Tom noticed and gently placed a hand on hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft and steady. Jessica nodded slowly, though her eyes betrayed the frustration that had built up inside her. "I don't understand why he did that," she whispered, looking down. "It's like he was targeting me for no reason." Tom took a deep breath, his jaw tight. "Unfortunately, some officers let their power go unchecked. But I won't let this go unnoticed, Jess." Before Jessica could respond, she noticed Carter lingering at a distance, his posture tense, watching them with a sour look on his face. She felt her heartbeat quicken. "Tom, he's still here," she murmured, nodding in Carter's direction. Tom's gaze followed hers, his face hardening. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. He walked toward Carter, each step filled with purpose, while Jessica watched anxiously. Carter's smirk returned as Tom approached. "Changed your mind, Agent?" he sneered, emphasizing the title with contempt. Tom remained calm, standing his ground. "Officer Carter, I'm giving you a chance to walk away with dignity. Whatever personal issue you have with civilians, it has no place here." Carter scoffed, folding his arms defiantly. "Dignity? You think you can come here and tell me how to do my job?" "I don't think," Tom replied, his voice unwavering. "I know what's right and what's abuse of authority. What you displayed here was nothing but harassment." Carter's face twisted with barely contained anger. "Listen, just because you're with the FBI doesn't mean you can interfere with how I conduct my work." Jessica felt the weight of the tension in the air as she watched, her hands clenching into fists. She wanted to call out, to tell them to stop, but she could see in Tom's stance that he wasn't going to let this go. "Your work?" Tom raised an eyebrow. "Is it your work to intimidate a woman sitting in a park? You saw her alone, and you took that as an opportunity to exert power over her. Tell me how that's justified." Carter's eyes flared, his fists clenching at his sides. "Maybe if she'd been more cooperative, I wouldn't have had to question her. It's not my fault some people don't know their place." Tom's expression darkened, but he maintained control. "Know their place," he repeated, each word filled with cold disbelief. She was waiting in a public space. Her place is anywhere she chooses to be. Jessica watched the exchange, feeling the flush of injustice warming her cheeks. Finally, unable to contain herself, she stepped forward, her voice firm. "You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't, officer. That's not your job." Carter's gaze shifted to her, a glint of defiance in his eyes. "Careful, ma'am. It's a thin line between standing up for yourself and resisting an officer." Jessica's voice trembled slightly, but she didn't back down. "I think you crossed that line when you approached me in the first place." Carter's face turned red, and he took a step closer to her, but Tom immediately moved between them, his presence shielding her. "Enough, Carter," Tom said, his voice now sharper. "This has gone far enough." Just then, another officer, a young woman with a calm demeanor, approached the scene. She looked between Carter and Tom, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" Carter turned to her, clearly annoyed by her presence. "This isn't your concern, Officer Lee," he snapped, his tone dismissive. Officer Lee raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting to Tom and Jessica. "Actually, if there's a problem, it is my concern." Tom nodded to her, grateful for her intervention. "Officer Lee, I'm Tom Parker with the FBI. My wife and I were simply sitting here when Officer Carter began to harass her without any cause." Lee's expression shifted, a hint of surprise crossing her face. "Is that true, Carter?" she asked, her tone laced with a warning. Carter's face tightened, his eyes narrowing at Tom and Jessica. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, his voice defensive, "making sure everything's in order around here." Lee's gaze sharpened as she looked back at him. "That doesn't justify harassment, Carter." Carter opened his mouth to argue, but Lee raised a hand, stopping him. "Why don't you take a walk, Carter? Let me handle this." Jessica could see the conflict on Carter's face, his pride clearly wounded. He hesitated, his eyes filled with resentment, but finally turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. Once he was gone, Officer Lee looked back at Tom and Jessica, her face softening. "I apologize on behalf of the department," she said quietly. "That was entirely uncalled for." Jessica let out a sigh, her body finally relaxing. "Thank you, Officer Lee. I was starting to think there was no one who cared." Lee shook her head, sympathy in her eyes. "Unfortunately, not everyone in uniform respects their role. I'll report this incident." Tom nodded appreciatively. "Thank you. This kind of behavior needs to be addressed. It's people like Carter who give others a bad reputation." Lee gave a small nod, her expression earnest. "I agree. I'll make sure this doesn't go unnoted." As she walked away, Tom placed an arm around Jessica's shoulders, pulling her close. Jessica could feel the tension easing, but a lingering sense of frustration remained. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Tom murmured, his tone gentle. Jessica leaned into him, closing her eyes for a moment. "It's not your fault. It's hard to believe people like him can get away with this." "They won't forever," Tom replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll make sure of that." They began to walk away from the park, their footsteps slow and thoughtful, as if the weight of the incident was still settling over them. The memory of Carter's sneering face lingered, a reminder of the lingering injustice they had just encountered. As Tom and Jessica left the park, Jessica's thoughts were heavy with frustration and disbelief. The look on Carter's face, the way he treated her with such disdain, it left a sour feeling that she couldn't shake. They walked in silence for a while, Jessica's hand intertwined with Tom's, her grip tight. "It just doesn't make sense," Jessica finally said, breaking the silence. "What kind of person treats someone like that for no reason?" Tom nodded, his expression serious. "Unfortunately, there are people who see the badge as a symbol of power rather than responsibility." Jessica sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I used to think I could trust anyone in uniform, but people like Carter," she trailed off, the weight of the encounter settling deeper. Tom's gaze softened as he looked at her. "Jess, Carter's actions don't represent every officer out there. People like him abuse their power because they think they're untouchable, but it doesn't mean they'll get away with it forever." Jessica shook her head, a faint bitterness in her voice. "It's just disappointing and terrifying. Imagine if you hadn't been there." Tom stopped walking and turned to face her, holding both her hands. "I won't let anyone treat you like that again," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "Carter needs to answer for what he did, and I'll make sure he does." They continued their walk, but before they could leave the area, Jessica caught a glimpse of a familiar figure in the corner of her eye. She froze, pulling Tom's hand slightly. "Tom, is that?" He turned in the direction of her gaze, and there, leaning casually against a lamppost, stood Carter, watching them with an almost smug expression. His eyes glinted with a kind of twisted satisfaction, as though the encounter had been some kind of game to him. Jessica's heart sank. "He's following us," she whispered, a chill creeping up her spine. Tom's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice calm. "Stay close to me," he murmured, his arm protectively around her shoulders as they approached Carter. Carter straightened, feigning surprise. "Oh, look who it is. The happy couple," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Can't get enough of me, huh?" Tom's eyes narrowed, his voice low but firm. "What do you want, Carter?" Carter let out a slow chuckle. "Just doing my job, Agent Parker. Making sure there's no suspicious behavior in my territory." Jessica's frustration boiled over. "We've done nothing wrong, Carter. This has gone far beyond doing your job." He raised an eyebrow, giving her a lazy smile. "Is that so? Funny how people like you always think they're innocent. People like us?" Tom's voice held an edge, his anger barely restrained. "What exactly do you mean by that, Carter?" Carter's smile faded slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean. Always thinking you're above the law, untouchable. But here's the thing. In my town, that badge you're so proud of doesn't mean much." Jessica felt a surge of indignation. "This is harassment, plain and simple," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You're just trying to intimidate us because you think no one will stand up to you." Carter took a step closer, his face mere inches from Tom's. "Go ahead. Report me." See how far that gets you. People like me. We protect each other. You'll learn that soon enough. Tom's fists clenched at his sides, his body tense. And people like me? We don't tolerate abuse. You can hide behind your badge all you want, but it won't protect you forever. Carter's expression darkened, the smugness vanishing as anger flashed across his face. Is that a threat, Agent Parker? Tom held his gaze, unflinching. It's a promise. For a moment, Carter looked taken aback, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge Tom's seriousness. Then, with a scoff, he stepped back, his face twisting with disdain. Fine, Carter sneered, spitting on the ground at their feet. You think you're better than me? Just because you have some fancy job title? Well, let me tell you something. Out here, people listen to me. They respect me. And I don't need the FBI to make that happen. Jessica could barely contain her disgust. Respect? Is that what you call this? Abusing people, threatening them. That's respect? Carter shrugged, his expression unfazed. It's survival. People learn pretty quick around here. Either you fall in line, or you deal with me. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper, every word laced with intensity. And maybe it's time someone taught you what it means to be held accountable, Carter. I'll see to it personally. Carter laughed, the sound cold and mocking. Good luck with that. I've been here long enough to know how things work. You think one complaint from you is going to change anything? Tom's gaze didn't waver. Maybe not today, but I'll keep coming back. And I'll make sure your superiors hear every single word of what happened here. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Carter's face. He seemed to hesitate, his bravado wavering slightly, though he quickly masked it with a derisive snort. Whatever, he muttered, looking away. Waste of time if you ask me. Jessica could feel her heart racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. She held onto Tom's arm tightly, feeling a mixture of anger and relief. Let's go, Tom, she whispered, wanting nothing more than to leave Carter's toxic presence. Without another word, they turned and walked away, leaving Carter standing alone. As they walked, Jessica glanced over her shoulder, half expecting him to follow. But Carter remained where he was, his silhouette dark against the fading light of the park. They finally reached the street, and Jessica exhaled deeply, the weight of the encounter settling over her like a heavy blanket. I can't believe that just happened, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom pulled her close, his expression pained yet resolute. I won't let this slide, Jess. Carter and his kind. They've thrived on fear for too long. It's time someone stood up to them. Jessica nodded, though a lingering fear tugged at her thoughts. Do you think it'll actually change anything? Tom looked down at her, his gaze fierce and unyielding. If we don't try, nothing will ever change. But if we do, then maybe, just maybe, we'll make a difference. Jessica squeezed his hand, the warmth of his grip anchoring her amidst the turmoil of emotions. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. For being here, for fighting back. Tom wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the sounds of the city began to fade into the background. Together, they walked away from the park, leaving behind the memories of Carter's menacing presence, but carrying with them a resolve to fight for justice. Over the next few days, Jessica tried to put the incident with Carter behind her, though his face, that mocking smirk, would come to mind at the most unexpected times. Tom, however, was relentless in his pursuit of justice. He filed a formal complaint against Carter, meticulously documenting every moment of their interaction. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Tom's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He glanced at Jessica, then answered, his voice calm and measured. Agent Parker speaking. There was a pause, then a low voice came through the line. This is Chief Reynolds with the local precinct. I'd like to speak with you regarding your recent complaint. Tom's eyes sharpened with interest. Of course, Chief. I was hoping to discuss it in person. Come by my office tomorrow morning, the chief replied curtly, then hung up without another word. Jessica looked at Tom expectantly. Is it about Carter? Tom nodded, his jaw set. It seems the complaint is being taken seriously. Maybe this is the first step toward real change. The next morning, Tom left early, and Jessica waited anxiously for his return. She tried to occupy herself, but her mind kept drifting back to Carter's face, his sneering words, and the thought that he might finally face the consequences of his actions. When Tom finally returned home, Jessica immediately sensed the tension radiating from him. "Tom," she asked, her voice soft, "how did it go?" He let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "The meeting. It didn't go as planned." Jessica's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Chief Reynolds was polite, but there was something off, Tom began, his tone dark. "He told me that Carter has had minor complaints filed against him before, but nothing ever proven." Jessica's eyes widened. "So, he's done this to others?" Tom nodded grimly, but Chief Reynolds brushed it off, said it was part of the job to receive complaints. Jessica's frustration bubbled over. "So he's just going to ignore it? Pretend nothing happened?" Tom's hand clenched into a fist. He promised they would review the situation, but it was clear he was just trying to pacify me. He even hinted that Carter's actions were misinterpreted. Jessica felt a chill run through her. Misinterpreted? How can harassment be misinterpreted? Tom's expression hardened. "It's a tactic. They try to make it look like we're overreacting. It's a way of protecting their own." Jessica looked down, a sense of helplessness settling over her. "So nothing will change, will it?" Tom took her hands in his grip warm and reassuring. "Not if we let it go. But I don't intend to." Just then, Tom's phone buzzed again. He glanced down at the screen, frowning. "It's from the precinct," he murmured, then picked up the call. "This is Agent Parker." The voice on the other end was familiar and cold. "Agent Parker," Carter's voice drawled mockingly. "Heard you've been busy with some complaints. Thought I'd check in and see how that's going for you." Tom's face tightened. "What do you want, Carter?" "Oh, just wanted to let you know, some things don't change around here. You might want to think twice before wasting your time again." His tone was thick with contempt, each word a reminder of his assumed invulnerability. Jessica saw the anger flash in Tom's eyes. "Carter, you may think you're above consequences, but I assure you you're not." A low chuckle sounded from the other end of the line. "I'm not worried, Parker. You see, people here know me. They trust me. They think you're the one causing trouble. Is that so?" Tom replied, his voice steady but steely. "I have every intention of making sure the truth comes out, Carter. You can count on that." There was a brief silence, then Carter's voice dropped to a whisper. "Good luck with that. People here know how to stay loyal. I wouldn't count on anyone taking your side." The line went dead, and Tom stared at the phone, his jaw clenched. Jessica's heart raced. "Tom, he's taunting us. He wants us to feel like we can't win." Tom nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the phone. "That's exactly what he's doing. He's banking on us giving up." Jessica took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "But we won't, will we?" Tom's gaze softened as he looked at her, determination sparking in his eyes. "Not a chance." Just as they started to process the call, another knock echoed through their front door. Tom rose to answer it, his expression guarded, as Jessica watched from the couch. He opened the door to find Officer Lee standing there, a cautious look on her face. "Agent Parker, Mrs. Parker." She greeted them with a small nod. "May I come in?" Jessica exchanged a quick glance with Tom, then nodded. "Of course, Officer Lee. Please, come in." Lee stepped inside, her demeanor tense. "I heard about the complaint," she said quietly, looking at them both. "I wanted you to know. Not everyone in the department supports Carter." Jessica's eyes widened. "Really?" Lee nodded, her expression serious. "He's problematic, to say the least. But he has friends in high places. People who make it difficult to hold him accountable." Tom crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "And yet, you came here." "Because I believe things need to change," Lee replied firmly. "But you have to be careful. Carter, he's manipulative. He'll twist things, make it look like you're the one causing trouble." Jessica felt a wave of gratitude toward Lee, mixed with lingering doubt. "So, are you saying we're at risk?" Lee's expression darkened slightly. "You need to be cautious. Carter's got connections, but I'll do what I can from the inside." Just know you're not alone." Tom nodded, his voice softened by a hint of relief. "Thank you, Officer Lee. We appreciate that." Lee offered a small, encouraging smile. "I'll keep you informed if anything changes. But just be careful. Carter doesn't like losing." As she left, Jessica felt a glimmer of hope, but it was fragile, overshadowed by the reality of Carter's influence and the quiet warning that had been left hanging in the air. When the door closed behind her, Jessica looked at Tom, her face reflecting both relief and lingering apprehension. "So, she's on our side?" Tom gave her a reassuring nod, though his expression remained cautious. "Yes, but this isn't over. Carter won't let this go easily, and neither will we." Days passed, and Jessica tried to keep her spirits up, but each interaction with Carter left an indelible mark. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, even as she attempted to move past it. Tom, too, grew increasingly frustrated, his resolve to bring Carter to justice clashing with the barriers thrown up at every turn. One evening, as Jessica prepared dinner, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, but something urged her to answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was smug, almost taunting. "Jessica Parker?" She froze. "Who is this?" "Let's just say I'm a friend of Carter's. And I thought you'd want to know that stirring up trouble in our town isn't going to end well for you or your husband." Jessica's heart pounded, her grip on the phone tightening. "Is that a threat?" "Take it however you want," the voice replied with a laugh. "But a word of advice? Drop the complaint. Otherwise, things could get messy." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Her hands shook as she lowered the phone, the air around her seeming to thicken. Just then, Tom entered the kitchen, noticing her pale face. "Jess, what's wrong?" Jessica looked up, her eyes wide. "Someone just called me. They said they were a friend of Carter's and told me to drop the complaint, or else." Tom's expression hardened, his face tightening with a surge of protective anger. "He's dragging other people into this now?" His fists clenched. "That's it. This has gone too far." He pulled out his phone, dialing Officer Lee's number. After a few rings, she answered, her voice cautious. "Agent Parker?" "Officer Lee, I need to speak with you urgently." Jessica just received a threatening call from someone claiming to be close to Carter. They told her to drop the complaint. There was a pause on the other end. "I'm not surprised. Carter has a few unsavory allies. Meet me at the precinct tomorrow morning. I'll make sure we have some privacy." The call ended, and Tom turned to Jessica, a fierce determination in his eyes. "We're not backing down, Jess. I won't let him intimidate us." Jessica nodded, though fear still lingered in her eyes. "I know. It's just, how far is he willing to go? This isn't just about us anymore, Tom. It's our safety, our lives." Tom pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I won't let anything happen to you. We'll handle this together." The next morning, they arrived at the precinct and were escorted to a small, secluded meeting room. Officer Lee entered shortly after, her face set in a look of grim determination. "I looked into Carter's history," she began, wasting no time. "He's been part of a few incidents, intimidation, abuse of authority, but every complaint against him has mysteriously disappeared or been dismissed." Tom leaned forward, his expression tense. "Who's protecting him?" Lee sighed, glancing at the closed door as if to ensure no one was listening. "Carter has connections in high places. Family friends, old colleagues, people who think he can do no wrong. They cover for him, make sure nothing sticks." Jessica felt a wave of hopelessness. "So what are we supposed to do?" "He's practically untouchable." Lee met her gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I don't believe anyone is truly untouchable, but this will be difficult. If we pursue this, we'll need solid proof, undeniable evidence that his behavior goes beyond misconduct." Tom nodded, his jaw set. "So where do we start?" Lee paused, then pulled a small folder from her bag. "I did some digging and found reports from other people who've had similar run-ins with Carter. Unfortunately, none of them were willing to come forward officially. He's instilled too much fear." Jessica took the folder, her hands shaking slightly as she flipped through the pages. Each account detailed a similar pattern. Threats, intimidation, the same mocking tone she'd heard that day in the park. "He's been doing this for years," Jessica whispered, anger and disbelief coloring her voice. "And no one has stopped him?" Lee shook her head, her face shadowed with regret. "People are scared. They think they'll face retaliation, lose their jobs, or worse." Carter knows exactly how to keep people silent. Tom's face hardened, his resolve clear. "Then we'll need to find someone brave enough to break that silence." Lee hesitated, then reached into her pocket, producing a small flash drive. "This is surveillance footage from that day in the park. I managed to access it before it disappeared from the records. It might not be much, but it's a start." Jessica's eyes widened. "You have footage? This could prove he harassed me without cause." Lee nodded, her expression grave. "But be careful. Carter and his friends aren't above tampering with evidence. They might try to discredit anything we bring forward." Tom took the flash drive, his grip firm. "We'll make sure this gets into the right hands." As they left the precinct, Jessica felt a glimmer of hope, but it was shadowed by the weight of the fight that lay ahead. "Do you think this will be enough?" she asked quietly. Tom's gaze was fierce, a spark of determination in his eyes. "If it's not, we'll keep going until we have what we need. People like Carter don't get to ruin lives without consequence." Jessica nodded, drawing strength from his resolve. "Then let's make sure he faces justice." That night, they watched the footage, the grainy images showing Carter's aggressive posture, his mocking face as he loomed over Jessica in the park. Her stomach turned as she relived the encounter, but the evidence felt like a lifeline, a small piece of truth they could use. Tom placed a reassuring hand on hers. "This is just the beginning, Jess. We're going to see this through." A few days later, Tom and Jessica received a summons to the precinct. They were to meet with Chief Reynolds, ostensibly to discuss the complaint in further detail. The air felt heavy as they entered the building, and Jessica clutched Tom's hand, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. They were led to a stark meeting room where Chief Reynolds waited, his expression unreadable. Across from him sat Carter, his face twisted in a smug smirk as he leaned back in his chair. "Agent Parker, Mrs. Parker." Reynolds greeted them with a nod, gesturing to the empty seats. "Please sit." Tom's gaze remained steady, refusing to be intimidated. He pulled out a chair for Jessica before taking his seat. "Chief, I hope we're here to discuss the resolution of this matter." Reynolds' eyes narrowed slightly. "We are. But I must say, your approach has created quite a stir around here." Carter chuckled softly, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're the first to try this, Parker? News flash. You won't get anywhere." Jessica clenched her jaw, her voice barely containing her anger. "People deserve to feel safe, and you don't get to decide who does and who doesn't, Carter." Carter leaned forward, his face inches from Jessica's. "Oh, you think so, sweetheart?" he sneered. "People listen to me because I know how to handle them. Not everyone can take the heat." Tom's voice cut through the tension like ice. "That's enough, Carter. This ends here." Reynolds cleared his throat, a forced calm in his tone. "Let's keep this civil, shall we? Now, Agent Parker, I understand you've submitted a piece of surveillance footage." Tom reached into his bag, producing the flash drive Lee had provided, and set it on the table between them. "This footage speaks for itself. It's proof of harassment without cause, Chief. Your officer overstepped his bounds." Reynolds picked up the flash drive, examining it for a moment before his gaze shifted to Carter. "You're confident about this?" Carter smirked, crossing his arms. "I know what happened. Whatever's on that drive won't change a thing. People will believe me." Jessica's fists clenched under the table. "You're underestimating people, Carter. Your badge doesn't make you invincible." Carter scoffed, casting her a dismissive glance. "Maybe not invincible, but it sure helps." Reynolds inserted the flash drive into a nearby laptop, the screen flickering to life as the footage began to play. Jessica watched in silence as the grainy image of herself sitting alone on the park bench came into view, followed by Carter's aggressive approach. The audio captured his mocking tone, his threats disguised as questions. As the video continued, Reynolds' face darkened, his jaw tightening. He paused the footage and turned to Carter, his voice deadly calm. "Care to explain this?" Carter's smirk faltered, though he quickly replaced it with a look of feigned innocence. "Chief, that footage doesn't show the whole story. I was simply making sure she wasn't a threat to the area." "Standard procedure." Jessica's voice rang out, clear and unyielding. "A threat? I was sitting alone, minding my own business. You saw an opportunity to assert power and took it. This footage proves that." Carter's face twisted with anger, his composure beginning to crack. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Just because you're married to an agent, you think you can bend the rules." Tom's voice was calm but razor-sharp. "This isn't about bending rules, Carter. This is about you facing consequences for your actions." Reynolds looked between them, his eyes narrowing as he studied Carter. "It's clear there was no legitimate reason for your actions, Officer Carter. I'll have to file a report and open an internal investigation." Carter's face reddened, and he leaned forward, his fists pounding the table. "You're really going to believe them? Over me? After everything I've done for this precinct?" Reynolds's voice remained steady, though there was a hint of steel. "What you've done is bring unnecessary scrutiny to this department. And if this investigation finds further evidence of misconduct..." Carter's expression turned from rage to desperation. "Chief, you can't do this. You know how it works. We protect our own." Reynolds's gaze hardened. "Protection doesn't extend to abuse, Carter." Jessica felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by the lingering fear that Carter would retaliate. But for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, the confidence he'd wielded like a weapon crumbling in the face of accountability. Carter's fists clenched and unclenched as he looked around, searching for an ally, but the room remained silent, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. Tom broke the silence, his tone filled with finality. "Your time of intimidation is over, Carter. The people you thought you could manipulate, they're not afraid of you anymore." Carter's mouth twisted into a snarl, his voice low and venomous. "You think this is over? You think some tape will stop me? I have connections, Parker. People who won't just stand by while I'm dragged through the mud." Jessica met his gaze, her own resolve unwavering. "You're welcome to try, but we're not backing down." Reynolds stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "That's enough. Carter, report to my office." "Agent Parker, Mrs. Parker. I'll be in touch regarding the next steps of the investigation." As they rose to leave, Carter's gaze lingered on Jessica, a final, chilling glare. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she refused to look away, her resolve stronger than ever. Once outside, Jessica released a shaky breath, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Tom placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride and relief. "You did amazing in there," he murmured, his voice soft. Jessica gave a small nod, though her hands still trembled. I never thought I'd have to stand up to someone like him." Tom's gaze softened as he wrapped an arm around her. "It takes real courage, Jess, and you showed him that he can't break you." They walked away from the precinct, the weight of Carter's stare lingering in the back of Jessica's mind. But the confrontation had sparked something within her, a sense of empowerment that made her realize they had the strength to face whatever came next. In the weeks following the confrontation at the precinct, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jessica and Tom lived with a sense of heightened awareness, looking over their shoulders, always wary of Carter's potential retaliation. Yet, the internal investigation into Carter moved forward, and the precinct seemed to adopt a hushed vigilance as officers awaited the outcome. One evening, Tom received a call from Officer Lee. Her voice was laced with urgency. "Tom, they're about to make an announcement regarding Carter. You and Jessica might want to be here." Tom glanced at Jessica, who nodded firmly. "We'll be right there," he replied. At the precinct, a quiet tension filled the room as they entered. Officers glanced their way, some with sympathetic nods, others avoiding eye contact altogether. At the front stood Chief Reynolds, his posture rigid, his face a mask of somber determination. Next to him was Officer Lee, who gave Jessica a small nod of encouragement. Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic edge. "After a thorough investigation, It has been determined that Officer Carter engaged in multiple counts of misconduct, including abuse of authority and harassment. Effective immediately, Officer Carter is relieved of his duties pending further legal action. A murmur rippled through the room. Jessica could see the flicker of shock and disbelief on some of the officers' faces, but it was the figure standing near the back of the room that held her attention, Carter himself. His face was pale. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscles twitch. He forced his way forward, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're making a mistake, Reynolds. You're turning your back on one of your own." Reynolds met Carter's gaze with a look of steely resolve. "This precinct doesn't stand for abuse of power, Carter. You were given a duty to serve, not to terrorize." Carter's eyes blazed with desperation. "I did what needed to be done. I protected this place when no one else would." Tom stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You used fear to keep people silent, Carter. You protected yourself, not the people you were meant to serve." Carter's glare shifted to Jessica, his lips curling into a snarl. "This is all because of you," he spat. "You just couldn't stay out of it, could you?" Jessica held his gaze, unflinching. "I stood up for myself, Carter. Something you never expected anyone to do." The room fell silent, all eyes on Jessica as her words hung in the air. She could feel her heartbeat pounding, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. She'd never felt so exposed, yet never so empowered. Carter sneered, a cold smile twisting his features. "You think this is over? I have friends, connections. You're going to regret this." Reynolds' voice cut through, sharp and final. "Enough, Carter. You're finished here. Anything else you do will only seal your fate further." Lee stepped forward, gently taking Carter's arm. "It's time to go, Carter." For a moment, he resisted, his body tense as if he might lash out. But finally, he relented, allowing himself to be led away, his expression a mixture of rage and defeat. Jessica exhaled slowly, relief washing over her, though a lingering sense of caution remained. As the officers dispersed, Jessica and Tom turned to leave, but Chief Reynolds called after them. "Agent Parker, Mrs. Parker," he said, his tone softer. "Thank you for your courage. This won't erase what happened, but your actions will prevent it from happening to others." Jessica nodded, her voice quiet. "I just hope it makes a difference." Reynolds gave a small nod. "It already has." Outside, the night air felt cool and refreshing, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere they just left behind. Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the weight that had hung over her begin to lift. Tom pulled her close, his eyes filled with pride. "It's over, Jess. You did it." She smiled, a quiet sense of triumph lighting her face. "We did it. Together." Just as they began to walk away, Officer Lee hurried out of the precinct, catching up to them. "Jessica, Tom," she called, her face alight with urgency. They turned, surprised. "What is it, Lee?" Tom asked, concern flickering in his eyes. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Carter, he made a deal. He's turning in other officers involved in similar misconduct to reduce his charges. This could open an entire investigation into systemic abuse." Jessica's eyes widened, processing the gravity of Lee's words. "You mean, this could go beyond him?" Lee nodded. "Yes, and it's because you both refused to back down." A mixture of shock and relief washed over Jessica as she looked at Tom, a sense of justice finally settling within her. "So this really is just the beginning?" Lee offered a small smile. "The beginning of a much-needed change, yes?" Jessica exchanged a look with Tom, her hand finding his. "I never thought we'd be the ones to start something like this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Tom squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes change starts with the people who least expect to make it. But you're braver than anyone I know, Jess." A quiet smile touched her lips as they stood together, absorbing the reality of what they'd accomplished. The night air was cool, but the warmth of hope filled her chest. They hadn't just fought back against one man's abuse of power. They'd sparked a shift, a ripple that could change everything. Jessica looked at Lee, her voice steady. "Thank you for standing with us. "We couldn't have done this without you." Lee smiled softly. "Thank you for not giving up. People like Carter only win when good people stay silent." As they walked away, Jessica felt a sense of closure. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. What a powerful story of resilience, courage, and the strength to stand up for what's right. Jessica and Tom's journey reminds us that when injustice appears, it's not just the initial victims who suffer, but everyone around them. They risk their peace, their safety, and even their faith in justice. Yet their resolve to hold others accountable made a difference. Stories like these remind us that true change comes when good people refuse to stay silent, no matter how powerful the oppressor may seem. Reflecting on their experience, we're encouraged to find courage in our lives to challenge injustices and to support others who face them, understanding that each act of courage creates a ripple effect. In our world, courage and kindness are the antidotes to corruption and cruelty. Let's carry this lesson forward by acting with integrity, protecting those who need it, and never underestimating the power of one voice. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to join us in sharing stories that inspire change. And let us know your thoughts in the comments. Every voice makes a difference.